Hello, everyone, and welcome back to class. I hope you are doing well. This is the first screencast for week number 3. And in this short screencast, I wanted to take a few minutes to review some of the week 2 articles. And I think what's interesting about these two articles is that they illustrate sometimes strengths of epidemiologic research and sometimes weaknesses. So let's take a look at the first one here. And the first one obviously was a prevalence study. So in a prevalence study, we're generally looking at what is occurring at one point in time. Taking a sample or looking at a cross section of a sample, and we can do comparisons. We can make comparisons about one group versus the other. And it can sometimes provide some interesting information. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times it doesn't show causation, but it allows us to potentially use it as a springboard to look at other research or to try to do other research. And it also helps us with health service planning. So this was a study looking at the prevalence and treatment of hypertension in two populations, those who are masters swimmers and those who made up the sample of the NHA-NES population. So on one hand, we're looking at people who are going out of their way to be physically active. So a very specific population of individuals, those who were members of the United States Masters Swimming Organization. The other group, so if we look down in the lower box there, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, it's a program of studies designed to assess the health and nutritional status of adults and children in the United States. So, a more general population of individuals. And we saw that from the article in and of itself, where we had differences in the size of the two cohorts. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but you can start to imagine that one population, because it is very specific, maybe has by design lower use of medication, maybe has lower prevalence of hypertension. Let's explore. So again, it's that comparison of individuals in the swimming population versus the general population. Now, what do you think? Do you think, and you probably saw this from the article, but probably just from the title in and of itself, you probably thought, oh, okay, this is kind of a no-duh type of study. If you look at the general US population, it's bound to be sicker or use more health services than a population of individuals who are more active. So the reason I have this particular slide in here is just to highlight that I want you thinking as we look at articles, thinking about the data analysis or the statistical analysis section. And the reason I say that is reading how other people write these sections are going to help you. They're going to help you to formulate that as you work on your dissertation in the future. I think it is very appropriate to model, not copy, but model how other people write things, because that is going to help your scientific writing. I chair a few groups right now, not groups, I chair a few dissertation studies of students at Rocky Mountain University. And one of the greatest challenges is moving away from conversational forms of writing to scientific writing. So again, just highlighting that in here, but also as you look at papers throughout this term, look at the types of statistics that they're using. I think we can learn a lot from that. That can really help us as we move forward. So table 1 here are the characteristics of the two groups. One group had 157 people, the other group had 1,592. Now, as I said before, that's probably not a problem to have such large differences. What do we see? We see that in this cohort of individuals, the percentage in the swimming population had a higher percentage of individuals who were Caucasian. We had a higher percentage of individuals who had some college or more in the swimming population. And the health status was excellent, very good, or good. And that was a higher percentage, again, in that population, as well as looking at the exercise category. So, provides us just some general information there. Table 2 illustrates that there was a significant difference in medication use for beta blockers and diuretics, significantly lower than in the general population. Now, there was not differences for some of the other medications. So the authors basically reported that those in the swimming population were healthier and they used less medication than those in the general population. So again, that kind of seems like a no-duh type of thing. Why do you think a study like this would be done? Well, for one reason, probably one of the reasons that you are all going into or doing this PhD program is that you want to work in an academic environment in the future. And part of your job responsibility or part of the reason, excuse me, let me rephrase that. Part of the process for being promoted from an assistant to associate to a full professor is to do scholarship. And so people need to do scholarship, whether that's the publication of research or presentation at conferences, things along those lines show scholarly activity. So this is a way for somebody to do scholarly activity. And if you have access to data, you can really do a lot of prevalence studies. And I would love to have access to large data sets because it'd be fun. It'd be fun to play in that data sandbox and look at these different relationships. The other thing, it could be that maybe this is an initial study that Guthrie et al. Were going to do something in the future. And so they wanted to have an initial study to show justification to do another study. For example, maybe they wanted to do an 8-week swim fitness study to investigate changes in blood pressure who are not currently exercising. Right? We saw in that first prevalence study that, people that are in a swimming population, they are healthier and they use less blood pressure medication. Maybe if we did a randomized control trial in the future and we took a group of individuals who weren't exercising and had high blood pressure, let's see what the effect is of swimming on blood pressure and blood pressure medication use after 2 months and compare it to the control group. So I tried looking through the literature to see if Guthrie et al. Had done anything else like that. This is what I found. Going on to PubMed, master swimmers use more dietary supplements than a large national comparison population in the United States. So they published in 2016 this paper, again, another prevalence type of study. So it doesn't look like they were doing anything with that initial study other than exploring that initial relationship. Again, what's the limitation? We can't say that there's causation there. We can't say the swimmers had lower blood pressure because of swimming, but it's that starting point. So hopefully that's making sense to you as we look at a prevalence type of study and maybe why prevalence types of studies would be conducted. If you do go into the literature, go to PubMed and put in swimming and blood pressure, you will find things. So maybe that was something Guthrie et al. They just found that others had done it already. Here is a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials looking at the effect of regular aquatic exercise on blood pressure. And it appears that that aerobic form of activity, just like other forms of aerobic activity, has a positive effect on lowering blood pressure. Now let's look at this next one here. Incidence and causes of sudden death in U.S. college athletes. So this is one that has evoked passion in prior classes because students, especially those with an athletic training background or maybe other sports medicine types of backgrounds, you get close to your athletes. You want to make sure that they are healthy. And the last thing that you want to have happen is any type of sudden death. And we see examples sometimes in the news media. There was one when I was younger that was a really big deal going back to Hank Gathers. Hank Gathers was a basketball player at Loyola Marymount. He had collapsed, identified that he had cardiomyopathy. He was being treated, continued playing. And then, as the story goes from Wikipedia, that either he didn't do a good job of following up on his medication and following up on his medical visits, and or the doctor didn't do a good job of saying, Hank, you need to come in and see me. Long story short, he collapsed again and died again as a result of cardiomyopathy. So people want to be able to screen people to make sure that that doesn't happen. Well, is sudden death due to sport something that we can, one, potentially predict, and two, potentially do something about? And that's what this study is trying to answer. And so their conclusions were, in college student athletes, the risk of sudden death due to cardiovascular disease is relatively low, with mortality rates similar to suicide and drug abuse, but less than expected in the general population. A substantial minority of confirmed cardiovascular deaths would not likely have been reliably detected by pre-participation screening with 12-lead electrocardiograms. So what they're suggesting here from their analysis is, if you had done this, you would have potentially missed some people with the 12-lead ECG who would have gone on to die. And as they'll suggest in the article, I believe it was in this article, you could have excluded some people from sport participation. And as a result of that, those individuals would not have had a fatal cardiac event. But what are the psychological and health implications to telling somebody you've got a heart that isn't good for activity? And I think that's a big thing too. Any of you who've looked at the American College of Sports Medicine criteria for participating in aerobic activity, they've done some great work in this area. And really, there's only certain situations where somebody should not be under the supervision or the monitoring of a physician. People should be active. They need to be active because there's a greater risk of doing nothing. So, as you read the introduction section, what I want to highlight here is this is a great introduction section because it's spelling out the problem and it's using data and it's suggesting, okay, sometimes there's sudden death in competitive sports. What is the known rate? We have tools that can look at heart health, but would doing screening, which would take a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of resources, actually help to reduce that risk? And so the arrow's pointing here to illustrate the sources that they found information related to those deaths. And they do a nice job of spelling that out. And in this table here, they do a nice job of presenting that also. Tables are a big thing in epidemiologic research. Of course, they're a big thing in all research, but when you look at a table, you need to be able to see and understand in depth, in this case, how was the death, or how did the individual die? How did that student athlete die? What was their age? What was their biologic sex? What race were they? What sports were they participating in? What level of competition? There is richness in the detail that is presented. And if we look here, we can see that there is confirmed or presumed cardiovascular death. 64, 47 of those were confirmed cardiovascular deaths. And we see the breakdown between males and females as well as by race. We also are able to make some initial comparisons with other ways that young people die. Figures are really nice. Here's another nice figure, and then also showing the different ways that those individuals died. So here are the mortality rates. And what we can see is the rate of death per 100,000 athlete participation years. And we're able then to compare those death rates versus the general population. So, for example, if we look at confirmed cardiovascular death rates, or even the confirmed and presumed cardiovascular death rates, and we compare that between the NCAA athletes and a cohort of the general population, we see the death rate in the population is significantly less than the general population. So, could an argument be made, maybe we should be testing the general population? Well, that would be also very difficult, time intensive, and expensive to do. But it's a nice way to make comparisons. And then table 4, the mortality rates in athletes compared with the general population, and doing so compared by race and ethnicity. So here, causes of death in young people in the United States, including NCAA athletes. And really, we see in perspective where the death rates due to cardiovascular diseases compared to other factors, cancer, suicide, motor vehicle accidents. It's a very small percentage. Now, I'm not discounting that any death is traumatic, especially in a young individual, especially in an individual that we perceive as being in better fitness than the majority of the population because of the things that they're able to do within sport. The authors concluded NCAA student athletes do not seem to be at a unique or particularly high risk for sudden death due to unsuspected cardiovascular disease. Furthermore, the relative importance of suicide and drug deaths reported here with respect to the health and safety of college athletes suggests that there may be a disproportionate focus on cardiovascular disease in the population. And that's the big thing about epidemiologic research. We oftentimes have limited resources, and so what should we invest those limited resources to? Could we have a bigger impact on mental health care, reducing drug use or abuse? Now, a couple examples of prevalence studies that I have published. Part of this team here, we were looking at patellar tendon abnormality and incidence of patellar tendinopathy in female collegiate volleyball players. So with this one, similar to a basketball study we did, we found that there was a low percentage of college level female volleyball players that presented at the start of the season with patellar tendon abnormality. And we also looked to see if those individuals that had patellar tendon abnormality at the start of the season were at a greater risk of becoming symptomatic. Interestingly, of the individuals who went on to develop a diagnosis of jumper's knee, none of them had the abnormal looking tendon at the start of the season. So here's an example of a table where we made those comparisons using an independent t-test at baseline. An incidence study example. So an incidence study, we're looking at injury rates and also to see if people are at greater risk of injury based upon some variable that we're looking at. In this study, we found that there were no differences in preseason jump and hop scores and risk of injury. But what we were also able to do were to present some unique injury rates for non-contact lower quadrant injuries in collegiate level basketball players. So you can see that in table 2A, the total there. And we were also able to compare starters and non-starters. Would you think that starters would be at a greater risk of injury? Sometimes people might think that because, oh, they're the starter, they're playing more often. However, that was not the case. Same thing, would guards or forwards be at a greater risk of injury? Would one, like maybe the forwards who also included the centers, we were thinking maybe they would be at a greater risk of injury because they're down low, they're fighting for rebounds, it's more physical down there. Again, no difference between groups. All right, so let's skip this one here. I'll talk more about this in our main screencast. Here's some past examples of some titles that cohorts before had done when coming up with their prevalence and incidence ideas. We've started to kind of sketch some things out. I just wanted to throw out some different ideas out there for you because these are all really creative and these are from the experiences of individuals who aren't necessarily physical therapy or athletic training. And I know in this class, we've got a very diverse group. That's exciting to me because I love to see the ideas that people come up with outside of my discipline or disciplines. And recently, an RMU student who I was part of his dissertation committee, I wasn't the chair, but I was part of the team. He passed his defense and his study was injuries sustained to elite fencers during national competitions and epidemiological inquiry of the 2018-2019 season. So basically looking at incidence data there.